Thank you. This is a very, very short, I hesitate to call it a lecture, but since it's billed as one, I'll go along with that. I think of it as an entertainment, but then what entertains me may not entertain you. At any rate, from the Annals of Translation. A student of mine here at the University of Chicago, Katya Mitova, came to my office not long ago with a problem. It was not the sort of problem students usually had about a course or a late paper. It concerned some papers her mother had sent her. Katya's mother lived in Sofia, in a large apartment house where there happened to live other women of her age who, like her, had been widowed, some as far back as the Second World War. These women avoided loneliness by maintaining close ties. Rarely would one be seen alone. They moved in groups to do the shopping, to walk in the park, or simply to sit in the sun. In the evening, they would play cards or watch television. The oldest and most frail of them, Anna Kay, was seen less and less with the others due to failing eyesight and limited hearing. It was generally thought that she had but a short while to live. One day she phoned Katya's mother and asked her to please come to see her. Propped up in bed, Anna Kay told Katya's mother that she wanted to give her something that she had had for years but had not known what to do with. First, she said she must tell her something of its history. It seems that Anna had a half-brother. Her mother had been married briefly to a Russian engineer who, when he learned he was soon to be a father, returned to the Soviet Union just before his son, Marin, was born. Still in her early 20s and attractive, Anna's mother moved in with a promising young journalist who took care of her and her infant son. The arrangement was a happy one. Within a year, they had Anna, and within 2, they moved into a spacious house. From the beginning, Anna and her stepbrother were close. 2 years older than Anna, Marin was her mentor and protector, walking her to school, helping her with her homework, and telling her which boys she could befriend and which she shouldn't. He himself was an excellent student, and during his teens wrote poems that were praised by his teachers and grudgingly admired by the other students. Anna recalled, however, that around the time he was 16, things began to change. Marin would come home from school and instead of going out to spend time with his friends, would shut himself in his room. It was assumed that he was working on poems. His isolation from others, even from Anna, increased and seemed at times edgy and hostile. He continued to go to school, but made sure everyone knew that he did not want to be there. Finally, he announced to his parents that he was quitting. Naturally, they insisted that he continue, and for days loud and bitter arguments took place. Then one night, Anna, looking down from her window, saw Marin go behind the house and set fire to what she believed were the poems he had been writing. By morning, Marin was gone. The note he left said only that he was going to join his real father in the Soviet Union. But in his haste to get away, he had forgotten to take a small notebook that he had hidden in the back of his closet and in which were written 6 highly contradictory, fanciful, and misleading autobiographical fragments. Anna speculated that his journey must have been long and arduous, for it was only months later that they heard from his father that Marin had arrived. He had arrived, but left soon after. Conscripted into the Red Army, he was sent to the German front. It was there, during some of the most ferocious fighting of the war, that he returned to poetry, writing his poems in a small notebook, which he kept in his breast pocket. In February 1942, the young poet was killed by a German bullet that passed through his poems and into his heart. His body was buried in a common grave where it remains. The notebook, a crucifix, and some loose change were sent to Marin's father. Not knowing what to make of the notebook, he sent it to his ex-wife, who kept it in a box along with the 6 autobiographical fragments. Anna knew nothing of the box until her mother died, when it was passed down to her, along with other of her mother's possessions. There was no indication that her mother ever tried to read the poems, most of which were still stuck together with dried blood. Anna herself confessed that though she had tried to read the poems, she gave up after the first few. The whole, she said, was a problem. Finally, she passed Marin's poems and autobiographical writing on to Katya's mother, suspecting that Katya, who was known to be literary, would be their ultimate recipient. Katya, who had never heard of Marin, was delighted by the opportunity to discover the young poet's work. Her delight was short-lived, for it soon became depressingly clear that what she had been given were the sparse remains of a young man's inner life, and that the zero left by the bullet not only memorialized his death, but more than likely canceled the meaning of his poems. Katya came to my office with her translations of the autobiographical fragments, which she found especially interesting. The poems, she said, would take more time. Her problem was that she felt responsible for the young poet's posthumous existence. Clearly, this was a responsibility she did not wish to bear alone. Would I look over what she had done and give her some advice as to how to proceed? Now, here are the fragments. I'm going to read them to you, but you have to remember that they were written by a 17-year-old boy. 1. I was born on the side of a mountain in the depths of winter. My mother tells me that snow drifted to the 2nd story and a tunnel had to be dug to open the front door. This was on February 3rd, on the outskirts of Vratsa. I weighed 9.5 pounds at birth and was thought to have the makings of a giant. My height made people think I was at least a year older than I was. As a result, expectations for me were considerably greater than they were for others of my age. 2. While very young, I wrote under an assumed name a prose masterpiece. It is not important, at least not to me, nor should it be to you, that this wonderfully precocious book is out of print. It is enough that I wrote it and must live with its memory, which casts a shadow over my many subsequent attempts to create works of value. The glory of that accomplishment was the grave of my hopes. It caused a sensation here. There's a mistake here. In Bulgaria and in France, Germany, and Finland as well. The only benefit I reaped was that of publicity. I became the most photographed 14-year-old in the history of Bulgarian literature. But that is not important. What is that I turned my attention to poetry, and that has been my downfall. 4. We lived in tents for a long time. My father liked the open air, sleeping on the ground and going for days without washing. Personal hygiene was not a priority for either of my parents. Even my mother had a thick, earthy smell about her. It goes without saying that I was a sickly child. We traveled by camel to places like Shiraz, Esfahan, Tabriz, Iran, Baghdad, and Basra. My father was a trader buying and selling rugs and trinkets. When I was 8 years old, my mother died, and I was sent to live with her sister in Sofia, where I went to school and did poorly. My father was killed by an American who wanted a rug that my father would not sell him. 5. I've spent my life trying to do away with my birth, but again and again, the brute fact of it stymies me. Okay, you were born, I say to myself, but why not mark the beginning of your life when you first saw a tree or learned to call the sun the sun? Why only one beginning? Why not a man of multiple births? Why not be a man of multiple births? 6. When I was born, the woman hanging laundry in the next yard burst into song, and suddenly all the other women of Varna started to sing. Then they all stopped, and there was silence. When I was born, the men who stood on the beach staring at the sea turned around to face the hills behind them. The dogs at their sides stood on their hind legs and bayed. Then they stopped, and there was silence. What was it about my birth that elicited with such magical suddenness signs of approval followed by stony indifference? No wonder my birth has confused me and left me of two minds about the way I affect others. What I noticed in these fragments was Marin's desire to locate himself anywhere but where he was born and to find an alternative to a banality that he felt was imprisoning. They also displayed a sense of humor in relation to his parents, who were made to appear unhappy, an unhappy mix of the exotic and the grotesque. Clearly, he wished to locate himself in his writing, the only world over which he felt he had control. As I read these fragments, I began to wonder what kind of poems Marin had written. I doubted that they would be what most of us think as war poems, that register the horrors of battle, or that ruefully talk of the wounded or the dead, or that honor bravery. I suspected they would be more fanciful, maybe even surreal. The restlessness that I found in his prose might be characteristic of his poems. And then it occurred to me that the autobiographical fragments amounted to a cancellation of himself. They were a set of erasures that suggested a negative presence, that is, one that denies its own existence by fostering the notion that it is another. Hadn't he said in the 5th fragment, "I have spent my life trying to do away with my birth"? I could not help but think of the horrible appropriateness of the bullet hole in the middle of his poems. If ever there were a negative presence, that was it. Marin's death seemed designed just for him. In anticipating his poems, I began to think less of what they might be and more about the zero at their center. I even thought that what surrounded the zero might prove to be irrelevant, that the true poem resided in the zero itself. Did a zero need translating? And if the zero was the dominant feature of the poems, did it matter what surrounded it? A line from an early poem of mine suddenly came to me. Wherever I am what is missing. No wonder it was so easy for me to base the value of Marin's poems, although I had not yet read them, on the part of them that was missing. I had an intuitive grasp of what was not there. No, the zero did not need translating. But if I were to fill the zero with what I felt the bullet had taken away, would that be translating, or would it be rewriting? It would certainly change what I had chosen to believe was the central character of the poems, what gave them for me their tragic dimension. In other words, it would normalize them, make them seem like other poems, and would force them to be judged without consideration for the very thing that set them apart. It might also be a kind of falsification. That is, if what existed before the zero was written in Bulgarian, how could I supply the missing original in English? I would be inventing and not translating. Besides, as a translator, I did not believe in taking liberties. But if I were to translate from a language I did not know, could it be said that I was taking liberties? Can one translate from a language he does not know? Some claim to, but they are actually editing someone else's literal version. Since I had no desire to put something where the zero was, such considerations were purely academic. It was my duty to preserve the zero, even without knowing what the rest of these poems might be. I believed in its modest and fateful emptiness. How could I improve on what so clearly and indivisibly, on what was so clearly and indivisibly itself? So powerful was my attraction to the zero of Marin's poems that I playfully considered erasing the part of them that was written, thus extending the zero and creating invisible poems. There was no precedent for such a tactic because, of course, no survivors exist. I was so charmed by this notion that I almost called Katya to tell her that we could dispense with her having to translate the written remains of Marin's poems. But because it became clear that such a plan would erase rather than extend the zero. The zero needed a shaping circumference. That is, it had to mean nothing rather than be nothing. To invoke Wallace Stevens for a moment, it was a case of having the nothing that is there instead of the nothing that is not there. Then I began to wonder what it would do to the zero if the surrounding poem was bad or just unexceptional. Would the clarity, precision, and beauty of the zero be damaged? If what Marin had written was not good, would it be wrong to make what I believed to be poem-saving changes? Probably. But then again, would not a good poem surrounding the zero make the presence of the zero that much more moving? And yet, what could I possibly write that would do justice to it? Nothing came to mind. The influence of the zero was overwhelming. To rid myself of this excessive valuation of the zero, I decided I would have to fill it in. At first I thought I'd have to see what remained of Marin's poems. Then I thought it might be more interesting if I just wrote a series of short, round poems that would fit in the middle of his poems. All I would need were the measurements of the whole. Somehow, however, I was reluctant to call Katya to tell her of my plan. She would almost certainly be shocked. My plan, I felt sure she would say, was nothing more than undermining the solemn reminder of Marin's death. After all, it was the whole that made his poem so irrefutably personal. Of course, I could write little round poems and dispense with Marin's surrounding words. Then I could extend what began as round poems to poems of a rectangular shape. In other words, I could fill in the hole and write poems that would eradicate whatever existed of the originals. not a nice thing to do, and my only justification would be that my poetry was better than his. This was debatable, since I had not as yet laid eyes on Marin's poems. Now, nor had I considered the possibility that Marin's poems would be very good, too good to be translated by Katya, too good to be played with by me. Perhaps my fascination with what was missing in Marin's poems and making that what I felt should be retained was only an unconscious way of acknowledging that something was missing from my own work, something central around which hovered the words I had managed to write, the things I had managed to say. But why would I elevate that which I had failed to accomplish? No, such a reading did not make sense. That is, the zero for me had become a mirror in which I saw nothing. Where my features had been, I saw a void, an openness, infinite and unanalyzable. Marin was my double. His absence was my absence. Wherever I am what is missing. That line was the message of Marin's poems, but I had written it years before I knew of them. I called Katya and told her that I'd like to see the poems, when what I really wanted to see was the whole. When she brought me the poems, which she had separated from the spiral binder, I was struck by their frailty. I held one up, that one, to the light. Held one up to the window, then held it against the white wall of my living room. I kept looking at it, holding it up, then down. I brought it close to my eye and looked through to the world outside. A car came by. A gust of wind shook a few leaves down from the trees. A few crows crossed my line of vision. That's all, folks. Katya Matova is in the audience, and she may be able to answer questions that you have better than I. In some ways, this was written so there might not be any questions.
Can you say something about this experience in relation to your experience of actually translating poems and whether it was a connection?
Well, my experience of actually translating poems is rather antique. It's quite old. I haven't translated in over 30 years. And when I translated, it was a kind of apprenticeship to being a poet. In other words, translation for me was a way of concretizing issues that remain vague in composing my own poems. That is, I had to make hard decisions about lineation and syntax. And in my own poems, I fudged a lot of issues. I wasn't responsible to an original, so I could, be a great deal freer. Although there's freedom in having something there to work on, as one does in a translation. It was also a way of just filling up time. I found some poets I liked, and so I set about translating them. I couldn't write my own stuff all the time. First of all, my own stuff wasn't as good as the stuff I was translating. You know, it's too bad for the poets whose work I was translating that a lousy poet got a hold of their poems to translate it in English. It's always better if you get a good poet to translate your work, or a better poet than you are. When Octavio Paz translated me, I mean, the poems were much better. You know. So,
You've written in writing about translation, you've written about the pleasure of and the centrality of finding the rough equivalent. Is this story too about finding the rough equivalent?
this?
Is this story also about finding a rough equivalent, about an equivalent that is also rough? And I mean, because that seems to be in your account.
Well, there's no equivalent. I mean, the problem is the zero is simply a zero forever. It is not translatable. Hence, since the zero was the dominant feature of those poems, there's no need to translate them. But the life of the poem really depended on the zero and the kind of odd story behind them. Yeah.
This is, I guess, a related question, but and sort of partially ignoring the fact that these are actually this was actually a notebook that you were given, but I mean the idea of a book of poems or the Bible sort of casually given to someone before war.
Can't hear you.
Sorry. The idea, the sort of the figure of like the book of poems or the book of like of Psalms or something casually given to someone before war as that then blocks a bullet to the chest is a fairly common one in even in sort of movies and popular culture.
Yeah.
And so I wonder. In terms of the sort of the difference between a book of somebody else's poems as a figure for something that is actually a sort of life-saving device, you know, like a literal life-saving device,
Yeah.
and his own poems as sort of not providing that protection, and then being sort of symbol of that not.
Well, we're talking about two different things, I think. No, the notebook didn't protect him from being dead, but it may have protected his sanity at the front. In that sense, they may have been life-saving. I mean, in a figural sense, in a figurative sense. You know.
I guess I'm sort of thinking of them as figures that are in some ways opposite, because in one version it's your own work, and the other version it's the work of another.
Oh.
So I wonder then, like how.
In what sense is it my own work?
Well, it's not.
Huh?
It's not. It was his own work.
Yeah.
Right, and so I'm wondering that how you fit into that.
Well, I wouldn't. I mean, I'm not sure I understand the question. I'm hard of hearing. So, yeah.
Well, I just would like to know if the image you showed us on screen, Mr. what size it was in real life, that is to say. Okay.
They're much smaller. Right, Katya? You
Yeah.
still have it.
And I have just another kind of question, which is probably the unspoken question, and maybe it's for Katya, which is, so what are the words like?
They're very much like Mark Strand's fonts.
You expect me to believe that?
Yeah, actually translating Mark Strand into Bulgarian helped me imagine what Marie Chernev would sound like in English.
And were those translations of the autobiographical fragments your translations?
Yeah, edited by Mark.
Slightly.
Because they did sound very much like your certain
Yeah, this is-
aspects
this
of your
Well,
work.
I mean, I felt a terrific kinship to this guy.
Yeah.
But that's the beginning, yeah.
What
Evan.
about the war problem? I mean, you don't want to translate with zero. You refuse to translate it, and thereby he remains invisible.
He remains anonymous.
Yeah.
I mean, he doesn't exist. Well, that's the risk we take, whether we write or we don't write. I mean, you know, I mean, eventually none of us will exist, you know. I found that I felt it's just no way for me to deal with those poems. I mean, I was so struck by the fact of the zero that I just couldn't do anything with it.
Well, what about the corollary? I mean, the corollary to that problem is that the poems aren't just being made anonymous. You're making them sort of analogous to you. I mean, you're making them analogous to you, or analogous to you. So it's almost, you know, an appropriation of the pathos of the story.
Well, I felt that way. I mean, I kept thinking of a line of mine as I was looking at his poem. Wherever I am what is missing. And I felt, you know, in some ways I felt he was a part of an older self of mine, and I just didn't want to mess with it. I mean, in fact, he does represent, in a way, my older, younger self. Yeah.
Anybody who works on ancient Greek poems, as I do, and likes to translate them, encounter this sort of thing all the time, right? But it seems to me that this zero, it's, I'm wondering if it's a real zero as you portrayed it, because it seems caught up in something like this young man's destiny. You know, it's an authentic zero and not an absurd zero, like you find in like Sappho. That zero has nothing to do. I mean, that's just an annihilation, a meaningless annihilation, right? But this one doesn't seem like it.
Yeah. I see what you mean. Well, you know, Katya and I have talked about it. I don't know what the poems say. I mean, she hasn't translated the poems. I mean, they exist still in Bulgarian. I suppose that she'll translate them.
Not after this lecture.
After.
I don't know. I don't
You
think
can translate the zero. You can.
I don't know.
But this zero has like an aura around it, right?
Yeah. Well, certainly I make a great deal of it. I mean, the aura has to do with my tremendous attraction to it. Yeah, I invested with probably more than I should. I mean, in some ways I feel I've invented the zero, created it myself, even though it killed him.
So did you invent Maureen Chernev also?
What?
Did you invent Maureen Chernev also?
Did I invent?
The person in your story?
Well, to a certain extent, yeah. Do you want me to tell the truth?
Okay. If you want to spoil everything, just tell the truth.
Okay, the truth is that, I mean, because we're not going to tell many people, I made him up, and that poem in Bulgarian is "Keeping Things Whole," which I thought a kind of sly joke, not thinking that too many people would know Bulgarian if they saw the thing on the screen. And so, I mean, I did it only to amuse myself. Certainly not. It's the kind of talk that can only shed darkness. So apparently, that's what I managed to do. It's successful. But yeah, Marin Chernev is Sea Black, or Black Sea, named for a poem of mine. Keeping Things Whole, that comes up in this. So that's, I mean, there it is. It's frivolous, totally frivolous. but I had to do something.
About that zero.
Zero? No.
So you got that.
So why isn't it about rough equivalence then? Because the absolute zero is blurred. It's blurred. I mean, the essay you've given is blurs the very thing that you claim is absolute.
Blurred in what sense? I mean, that,
Well, in the sense of an aura, that would be one way.
Well, my relationship to it is a blurring factor, I think. The fact of the zero is pretty absolute, though. Yeah.
Is it the Aleph that you had in mind when you wrote the story?
Is it what?
The Aleph that you had in mind. It seems the opposite story. The one that turns out to be a false Aleph, and the real Aleph contains everything.
Yeah.
The real zero contains nothing. The false zero.
Well, I didn't have that in mind, to be truthful, although I love the story. I mean, I usually don't have much in mind. I try not to think of other literature when I write. I don't consider my writing very literary. Yeah.
Was there a particular reason for the arrangement on the page? It surprised me that the hole was high, and then that made me ask the question of why had I thought the hole would be right to the center and that there would be poetry at the top and all around it, and I realized, well, because part of the way you described it. And then, of course, the blood was very striking as well, and I started thinking about ways that the letters could be recovered underneath the blood.
Well, we're going to redo the whole. It's going to be in the middle next time.
We
When I publish
we
it,
wanted to avoid the title. That's why
Is that
the call
right?
is so.
Is that right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
because
that makes
if the title is there, some Bulgarians here will read it immediately and will realize that this is Mark's.
you see, I gave it away anyhow. As you kept asking questions, and I was up here and I said, everything you say is a lie. Finally, I couldn't stand it. I mean, I made it up.
In any case, the foraging was the most pleasurable part of it.
I would imagine.
I'm telling you. Pure pleasure. And I wrote my translation of Mark's poem, but I used some letters that do not exist in Bulgarian alphabet anymore to make it really very adequate. So the handwriting also is kind of not mine. I tried.
A hoax.